أقم الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
استووا تقاربوا. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. والسماء بنيناها بأيد وإنا لموسعون. والأرض فرشناها فنعم الماهدون. ومن كل شيء خلقنا زوجين لعلكم تذكرون. ففروا إلى الله إني لكم منه نذير مبين. ولا تجعلوا مع الله إلها آخر إني لكم منه نذير مبين. كذلك ما أتى الذين من قبلهم من رسول إلا قالوا ساحر أو مجنون أتواصوا به بل هم قوم طاغون. فتول عنهم فما أنت بملوم وذكر فإن الذكرى تنفع المؤمنين. وما خلقت الجن والإنس إلا ليعبدون. ما أريد منهم من رزق وما أريد منهم أن يطعمون. إن الله هو الرزاق ذو القوة المتين. فإن للذين ظلموا ذنوبا مثل ذنوب أصحابهم فلا يستعجلون. فويل للذين كفروا من يومهم الذي يوعدون. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. قل إنما العلم عند الله وإنما أنا نذير مبين. فلما رأوه زلفة سيئت وجوه الذين كفروا وقيل هذا الذي كنتم به تدعون. قل أرأيتم إن أهلكني الله ومن معي أو رحمنا فمن يجير الكافرين من عذاب أليم. قل هو الرحمن آمنا به وعليه توكلنا فستعلمون من هو في ضلال مبين. قل أرأيتم إن أصبح ماؤكم غورا فمن يأتيكم بماء معين. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. We had promised last Thursday to continue today and talk about how to build an Islamic personality for ourselves and how that will be reflected or transmitted in our children. But because of the events that took place, we're going to put this off until next week. And today, inshallah, we'll talk about some major event that will affect the whole world in a way or another. Let me just take a quick unscientific poll here. How many of you, before you went to sleep yesterday, knew that yesterday, before you went to sleep, that Russia invaded Ukraine? Before you went to sleep. Well, how many of you got to know that Russia invaded Ukraine by today at noon? With the last night ones, everybody, those who by noon. Okay, how many of you, until now, news to you that Russia have invaded Ukraine? This is news to you, okay? No problem. I mean, this is just reflect. Sometimes, a person is busy, is not following. So I'm just trying to get. So, mashallah, that's a good number. That's a good number, and that's something good that we are following, and within, of course, the reasonable time. So, what had happened last night, our time, Russia-Ukraine time this morning, is Putin of Russia commanded his soldiers to invade Ukraine. And a few weeks back, we devoted a whole lecture on Ukraine. And at that time, we said that given the circumstances, Russia can get what it wants without war, that the invasion, a full invasion, is not, the expected option. So what had happened? What had changed? First of all, you need to understand that Ukraine has been in the Russian sphere of influence until 2014. Until 2014. And in 2014, there was a major change where the West was able to do an upset and get the influence, their own influence in Ukraine, and to have Ukraine within the West sphere of influence, especially the US. At that time, as a revenge, Russia invaded the Crimea, Jazirat al-Qarm, that we said was ruled by Muslims for 300 years. They took over Crimea and said this is now, from now on, part of Russia. And we explained the circumstances then, that this is used to be part of Russia, and they give it as a gift to Ukraine in the early 50s. But what had happened then is Russia forced an agreement to stop the fighting, and it's called the Minsk Agreement, on the location where this thing was signed. Minsk Agreement. And in the Minsk Agreement, basically, Russia put a condition and Ukraine agreed to it, that the two sections that is mostly dominated by Russian speakers on the east of Ukraine will be having their own status within Ukraine. But they will have a say in foreign affairs. All this is for one thing, to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. That was really the bulk or the focus of this agreement. If we trace back when the Soviet Union collapsed, the US made a commitment to the leadership of the Soviets at the time: we will not expand eastward. Meaning, we will not bring Poland, Romania, Latvia, and its sisters under NATO. They made that commitment. And slowly but surely, they were adding one after the other. It got to the point that they wanted to add Ukraine. But we said Ukraine is the largest country in Europe after Russia. And it is the buffer between Russia, the motherland, and NATO. So if Ukraine goes to NATO, then NATO is in the borders of Russia. And that's for Putin, no, no, no. And it's not just Putin, for the Russian leadership. You know, they said it's not enough that you have violated your commitment and included all those European countries who were under the Soviet Union. But of course, Russia was weak, poor, backward. Yeltsin really put this country down for many, many years of what he does. He sold it for free to whoever bid more. So this Minsk Agreement basically was the key that Putin had planned 8 years ago. So what had happened is Putin came and said, here is 130,000 soldiers. You know, we want to apply the Minsk Agreement. We want this agreement to be effective. And now, and really Ukraine have shown some flexibility. So a top Ukrainian official said 2 weeks ago that we are willing to give up on being members of NATO. And this was a top official. Within hours, he came out and took his words back. He said, no, Ukraine has the right to be a member of NATO. We are a free country, and we are an independent country. So how come? You have to understand that when the election in Ukraine happened, who became the president? A comedian. You know what's a comedian, right? واحد بيضحك. So he just, he makes jokes and people laugh to it. Imagine, we have, those guys who make the jokes on TV, one of them become the president. Well, we have worse than that. We got Donald Trump, but anyway. So imagine this guy was a Jewish comedian, suddenly he's the head of Ukraine. And he is totally, as you can see from how the events really transpired, he's neither a politician nor a person who understands what is happening, although he's the head of the country. And he's supposed to have his own intelligence. And he's supposed to be, in contact with the US and other countries. So what had happened most likely is when this top official said we are willing to compromise, we will keep the integrity of our country, but we will not join NATO. And of course, at that point, the objective is already taken care of. But of course, the US have pressured them. No, absolutely not acceptable. Don't give up to him. We are there for you. We'll support you. And it's, just like the shaitan, يعدهم ويمنيهم وما يعدهم الشيطان إلا غرورا. We will be with you. We will be with you. We'll send this. We'll do this. And when things got serious, Biden pulled, there were some soldiers, American soldiers in Ukraine doing training, he pulled them out. And he made it clear that we will not enter into a fight with Russia over Ukraine. And Ukraine will not compromise on insisting of being part of NATO. So this is the US push. And when things got serious 2 days ago, basically, Russia took over 2 regions that have the bulk of the people there speak Russians. And Russia, from 2014 until now, gave 700,000 Ukrainians the Russian citizenship. And those are people basically loyal to Russia. So all the preparation were ready for Russia to take care of those two regions and saying this is independent regions, and they sent their own soldiers. This was 2 days ago, and they said those are peacekeeping. So there will not be fighting between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And of course, last night, all of you by now hopefully know, a full-scale war. CNN reporter went to Kiev this afternoon. Kiev is the capital of Ukraine. And he saw soldiers. He thought they were Ukrainian soldiers. So he went and said, you know, we heard that the Russians are close on Ukraine. Where are they? And the guy told him, we are the Russians. So the Russians are already in Kiev, the capital. And to secure that, they took and occupy the Chernobyl. Many of you remember the Chernobyl nuclear accident. This whole area, which is mostly uninhabited, is the shortest cut to go from Russia to Kiev, and that's how they control the bulk of the capital. So today, inshallah, what we're going to do, use this as an example to understand how do we read events, how do we understand events, how do we distinguish between opinion and fact when we read, how do you collect information, how do you analyze them. But the bottom line is, this event is major, and it will shake the world order. Unless something, you know, out of the ordinary happen, it's not expected that the US will enter a war. But what will happen is the US theory of being the only superpower for 100 years, that was their theory in the mid-90s, that we're gonna prevent any country from being number 2 or number 3 or number 4. That the US is their number 1 and there's no number 2, 3, 4. And this has been the case until the last few years, when China and Russia felt that they have a role to play in the world. And of course, you know, the US would be the biggest hypocrite. They already went into Iraq for no reason. So what's different? You know, when I hear the conference of Ukraine, of Biden today, talking about the invasion of Ukraine, just replace Putin with Bush, replace Ukraine with Iraq, and see how the picture fits. So in fact, you know, they have made it easy on others to look down at anything called international law, international order, and nobody cares about their sanctions. It's interesting that they did not put the Russia out of the SWIFT system. If you put them out of the SWIFT system, you know, it just first of all show a weakness because they cannot do more. Secondly, it will get Russia totally out of the financial market. What they did with Iran is the same, and Iran had to drive trucks full of pure gold to Turkey to pay for the products, because basically you cannot deal with banks. And they asked, you know, Biden today, are you putting? He said, not yet. Why? Because the Europeans are not agreeing. And this just shows that the Europeans are no longer agreeing to the leadership of the US fully as before. So I'll see you inshallah in 10 minutes to continue inshallah. Jazakumullahu khair. May Allah bring the khair and the good for this ummah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy on those civilians who would be paying the price for all of this. الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد, again we do apologize for not having the session on building the Islamic personality. Inshallah, this will be the subject for next week, how to build an Islamic personality and how that would impact, ourselves first and then our children. So this will be for next Thursday, inshallah. But today we will discuss how to understand the events taken into account this issue of Russian invasion of Ukraine as an example. It's a live example, and we need to understand it and understand how the world order itself would be shaped in this regard. And to start, to understand events and to analyze them and to, if you are in a position to recommend policy, there are steps that need to be taken. Basically, those events, it's not that we will follow them and understand them in vacuum. As we talked about the days of the Sahaba, people were familiar with the war that took place between Persia and the Roman Empire, although they were far from Mecca. But they were aware of it, and the Quran in Surah Al-Rum discuss it. So Muslims who look at the world from a perspective of the da'wah, that this deen came to for the whole of humanity, need a good number of them, not all of them, at least a good number of them need to understand what is happening around the world. Or, if we are not able to recommend policy, there's not an Islamic state to act on this, then we will need to raise a generation to understand these things. So it will be an ummah of awareness. So the first step would be collecting the news. Collecting the news. That's your first step. Just when I asked in the Khatara how many people knew of this event before they slept last night, there was a good 35% of people who raised their hands. You know how many people knew before noon? So that's a good sign. That's a good sign. So be aware of the news. And to collect the news, you need to rely on some sources. You are not a news agency, or you do not own a news agency. We do not have really a trusted Islamic news agency that's, on the level that we need it. There are some here and there. But at least I would recommend to collect the news and follow the news. For now, Al Jazeera, Arabic and English, would be a first source. BBC would be a second source, Arabic and English. For those who know Arabic and those who do not know English, there's the English that is there. In the US, the New York Times, to a lesser extent, the Washington Post. Washington Post, mostly you rely on for news about the US. So if there is major news around the world, mostly it'll be New York Times. News about Washington, D.C. and politics and, Republicans and Democrats and what's going on, it's the Washington Post. Once in a while, the Wall Street Journal also have some good reporting. Now, what we need to know is that the truth is somewhere. But you cannot rely on one source to get the truth. You cannot say, I will only rely on Al Jazeera. They will really give me what's going on, the truth. No, because Al Jazeera is subject to the Qatar, who's good with Qatar, who's not good with Qatar, and this effect. You have noticed in the old days, Al Jazeera was way anti-U.S. policies in the Middle East, and they used to, parade the U.S. crimes in Iraq and U.S. crimes in Afghanistan. And suddenly there was a switch, and the Jazeera tone went down drastically. It's the pressure from the U.S. on Qatar. Because I think many of you remember in the early stages of the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war, Jazeera was very, very strong in following and parading the news. They were not just making, reporting a news. They were just giving you exactly what's going on and parading the U.S. for its crimes and telling you, why is this happening? Why is this happening? They said, okay, the U.S. pretend to be, want to make some kind of a system that would satisfy the Shiite and the Sunnis and the Kurds in Iraq, and the Al Jazeera will come and expose them on that this is not really what they are doing, and they will show you evidence in this regard. Same thing, the BBC, although supposedly an independent agency, but it's still influenced by the British policies in this regard. The American media, and here specifically the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, we have seen clearly that they were all the way with the government on Iraq, although this was a baseless claims about weapons of mass destruction. That's why I said the truth is somewhere. You need to search for it. That's one item. The second item is that you have to distinguish between news and opinion. And those who are professional in the field, they will confuse you. What is it, a news or a fact that he reports or she reports, and what is it their opinion? What is it that is their opinion? Because it makes a big difference. You will be reading something and thinking that, oh, this is actually a fact. This is what had happened. And it turned out, no, this was this person's opinion, who is writing the news in a way to influence you and some others in this regard. And then, there's the propaganda that really you should realize and recognize and do not pay much attention to it in this regard. After collecting this information, you have to have an understanding of the world order. Who is in control? Who is in control of this world at this point? Somebody will say Allah, of course. Allah is in control. We are talking about countries. So in the mid-90s, the US have drafted a white paper. And in that white paper, the US plan was for the next 100 years. This is mid-90s. So it's now, let's say, for the next 80 years. But that point was for the 100 years to come. That the US want to prevent any country in the world from becoming number 2 country. And what do I mean by number 2 country? If you look throughout the history, you will find always there is a dominant power. For example, at the time of the Romans and the Persian empires, they were competing who will be number 1 and who will be number 2. And they were trying to have influence on the surrounding areas. They rule countries all over the place. And the wars between the Roman and the Persian empires really came at the right time that Allah, the qadr of Allah was there. Because by the time that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam controlled Arabia under the Islamic State, newborn Islamic State. The Roman Empire and the Russian and the Persian Empire have weakened each other. So the road was open, although the Sahaba radiallahu anhum sacrificed big sacrifices, but the road was wide open for a new power to arise. And that's how Islam, the power of Islam, came and dominated the power, the world for about 800 to 1,000 years, where the Islamic State was the center of power. They reached within the 100 years of the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Islamic State was on the borders of France. What was their tool? The pen and the camel and the horse. To the point that a Westerner, an Orientalist from Spain, he says it can't be. They had to have some out of the ordinary weapons that they could do this in this short period of time. And most likely this weapon is gone. We do not know anything about it. Because when you study it, really, it's mind-boggling. I mean, when you look at the Battle of Yarmouk, for example, I read a master's thesis by one of the American officers who wrote it for, I guess, his master's degree in this college. And he said that, and he goes in detail, how Khalid bin Walid, with a fraction of the army of the enemy, was able to wipe out everyone and keep two young soldiers and told them to go back to the emperor and tell them what they saw. I mean, this just shows how he did it. You know, you need to read history. But basically, Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anhu, since Muslims are, you know, very light, he have his horse or camel and his sword. And the Romans, what do they have? And the Persians, they have heavy armory. So he kept dragging them in Jordan till he got them exhausted, and then he attacked them, wiped them out. How that, you know, took place, or the details, is what give you a perspective of how the newborn power was able to reach its peak within a short period of time. Okay? But let's go to the next step. At one point, you start having the British growing power around the world. And who was fighting or competing with them? The French, the Germans. And there was conflicts. Allah yarda alayk ya batan. There was conflicts and conflicts. At one point, people will, you know, make agreements. So, for example, you know, the British will take over Egypt and allow France to take over part of North Africa, because none of them was of the power to cancel the others. So understanding the role of the world powers at any time is very, very crucial, very, very important. In fact, yesterday, the British foreign minister was saying that he's talking about himself, the British, we defeated the Russians under the Emperor Nicholas. Isolate him and defeat him. And he said, we are able to defeat Russia, which was also, you know, for everyone as a joke. Now, what is he talking about, by the way? He's talking about a battle that the British, the French, and the Ottomans, the Muslim Ottomans, were allies against the Russians, and they defeat them. So it was not the British. Everybody who's familiar with that history knows. So anyway, World War I and World War II were really the place where powers try to eliminate other powers and take over. The US became involved in World War I, but then they withdrew back. And they left it still to the French and the British and the Russians to play the role. But in World War II, the US got in They took over, and from that point, they went after the British colonies, the French colonies, and they formed NATO to stand against the Soviet Union. From that point on, we have two major powers, the US and the Soviet Union. By the end of 1980s, there was a collapse of the Soviet Union, so the US became the dominant power, and no one is arguing. Whatever the US want to do, so when Saddam invaded Kuwait, the US got 500,000 soldiers, went to the borders, invaded Kuwait and Iraq, and took care of that matter. We are in charge. And that's when this white paper came, that for the next 100 years, we will be in charge. So that we will need to understand who is in charge, who is making decisions. For example, countries, which is like a superpower like the US, and a country that have some status like Iran. In actuality, there's no conflict. There's no strategic conflict between the US and Iran. They can work together. So what's the issue? The issue is that Iran saying, look, I am a country that I have status, I have history, I have power, I have this, because until the last century, the Safavis in Iran and the Uthmanis were the two dominant. Of course, to the less effect were the Safavis, but they were always in conflict with the Uthmanis. And experts say if it was not for the Safavis, the Uthmanis would take over Europe. But the Safavis were collaborating with the Europeans against the Uthmanis. So Iran thinks of itself as the inheritance of this Safawi dynasty. And what they want is they want their space. Give us a space to control the Gulf. And the US, of course, want to control the Gulf. Who will milk the Gulf? The US or Iran? Of course, the US want to milk the Gulf. If the US get weak to a certain point or get busy in other areas, they may make a deal with Iran. Okay, you can have control over those areas, but we will get this and you will get this. But the US feels that, what's Iran? Nothing. They are a country that should be only part of our sphere of influence in the Middle East. So if you look in this case of the Iranian foreign minister saying, if it's not to us, this is the Iranian foreign minister, the US would not have control of Afghanistan and Iraq. We are the one who helped. I mean, this is not something secret. He said it in his home. No, this was public. And you see the negotiation now that's happening on this. So this is an example. Another example is Saudi. Of course, Saudi is not Iran. Saudi is nothing. The Houthis, they can take over Saudi because the Saudi does not have an army. In the old days, it was the National Guard, Al-Haras al-Watani, that was in charge. So the army is not really an army that can do much. So that's what Trump said. He said in public. He said, I told the king of Saudi Arabia, if it's not for us, you will not stay for 2 weeks in power. And he's right. Just like Kuwait did not stand for a few minutes by the time that just the Iraqi army get to Kuwait, neither the Emirates, nor Qatar, nor Saudi Arabia, nor Jordan, nor this, nor that can stand. If you want more, you can see how they got rid of Hosni Mubarak. It was Obama and Hillary Clinton who told him, you need to go. Some people say the revolution. No, there was a movement. It was not a revolution in that sense. So it was, clearly, just look at the history. It was the Obama and Hillary who tell them, get out. And open the way for a change within the plan. Because the US had a plan to have Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Egypt, just like Erdogan in Turkey, to have the so-called moderate Islam. Of course, things did not work out. UAE and Saudi funded a coup against Morsi, Allah yarhamah. Of course, there were mistakes that were done before, but that's not our subject. So all those examples show how the big power deal with the small powers. Now, in the Middle East, there are two countries that defy the US and can say no to the US to a certain power, to a certain degree. Turkey and the Zionists. Turkey because now it wants to have its space in the world, and the Zionists because they have the support of Washington, D.C. And they consider themselves the beachhead of the new colonialism in the Muslim world in this regard. So we will need also, after we know who is in charge, the world order, to connect al-ma'lumat, the information. So we collect the information, we know who is in charge, and then we need to start connecting the information. Because countries that respect themselves plan for years to come. You could see that what Putin did in 2014 with the Minsk Agreement 8 years ago. It was in preparation for last night. Because he said, look, let's apply the Minsk Agreement. Which means Ukraine will say, I will not be part of NATO. And at one point, the Ukrainians were flexible. But then they came back, as I said. So, see, I'm going to give now opinion, not information. Most likely, because the US have pressured them to change. That's an opinion, not an information. I'm giving you my perspective. Based on what? Based on you cannot have a top official of a country under threat, a top official issuing such a statement that we are flexible, we are willing to compromise, meaning, let's sit and talk. Yes, in principle, we will not join NATO. This is not somebody who is, just said some words that have no value. Because they felt, the president of Ukraine, if you remember the first major news conference that Biden gave, what did Biden say in that major news conference? He said, we will have devastating sanctions on Russia if they invade Ukraine. However, if they did limited action in Ukraine, that would be another story. How many of you remember this first news conference? Okay, I have at least 2 or 3. Good. So when he said this, the president of Ukraine issued a statement saying they had a deal behind our back and they sold us. The president of Ukraine said they made a deal, meaning the US and Russia, they made a deal behind our back and they sold us. Because this came after a meeting that Biden had with Putin. So basically what Biden is saying, okay, if Russia will take those small 2 separatist regions, which are mostly Russian-speaking, he did not put it that way. He said if it was limited, and this is what's meant by limited, this is an opinion again, not a fact. Because he did not say if Russia took over those 2 regions. He said if it was unlimited. What's limited? This is a limited action. And Putin have made it clear that this part have to have a special status. And a few days back, he even called it, and we recognize their independence, and he calls upon the world to recognize their independence, and he sent his army in. So from that perspective, from that point, Ukraine feared that there are some deals. But the US kept saying, we will be with you, we will be with you. And they start, encouraging European countries to send armament and weapons to Ukraine. Now, the largest economy in Europe is the German economy. And the German economy relies big on Russia for their power supplies. Because the natural gas that Europe depends on, the bulk of it comes from where? From Russia. So what did the Germans do? They sent 5,000 helmets. 5,000 helmets to Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine can read the writing on the wall. It's just somebody who said, I am having your back. I am having your back. I am having your back. And then slowly, you see clearly that they are not serious. Why or to what extent did the Ukrainian intelligence have access to foreign intelligence to see what was going on? That remained to be seen. But what was clear is Ukraine was ready to compromise before someone said, no, you can't. And the one who can say to Ukraine, no, you can't, is the US. Because in the past few years, the US have been pumping tons of money to take over and enhance the infrastructure within Ukraine to prepare it for separation from the Soviets. Because you have to understand, Ukraine electric grid is connected to what? To Russia. It's only today that the electric grid was cut from Russia. And Ukraine has nuclear power, many reactors. Where? From the Soviet Union. Where does the fuel come? From Russia. Now, not the Soviet Union, but those are from the days of the Soviet Union. So basically, Ukraine is a poor country. It's a backward country. It's a poor country, backward country. So there are not, don't think, there's this huge natural resources that are there that Russia is after. No. Russia is after its own security. And then when they realize that with influence, they will not be able to change, they decided to invade. They decided to invade. Because this was made clear from the beginning that all what we want is to get the Minsk Agreement to be executed. And Russia somehow thought that the West will be on their side, pressuring Ukraine. Look, this is very dangerous. What happened last night, I would testify to you, is the major event that have taken place since September 11. And you know September 11, how much it changed the world. From the concept of terrorism, to the invasion of Afghanistan, to the invasion of Iraq, to the eventually tried by Saudi and UAE to invade Qatar. If it was not for Qatar making an agreement overnight with Turkey, and the Turkish tanks were in Qatar the second day. So many people tried to use this period of time to make their own advances. Iran made its own advances in Yemen and in Lebanon and in Syria. The US was busy with Iraq and Afghanistan when Iran almost took over Syria. And then there was an agreement between the US and Russia for Russia to go and take over Syria. They did not take over Syria to protect Assad, because already the Iranians have hit the revolution and took so-called revolution again, because people may differ on what it means and who's involved. But Russia was there or came there to protect Syria from influence of Iran. And if you remember when, we heard from Trump, who usually speaks on these things, he was saying, we thank the Russians for what they did. And we know that when, the US and Russia got together and made an agreement on liquidifying the chemical weapons in Syria. You know, Obama said there's a line. If it exceeded, meaning using the chemical weapons against his own people, this is a red line. We'll take care of it from there. Of course, he did not. And that's what Erdogan got mad with and stopped talking to Obama, because he realized that the US want Assad to stay. And if you want, for those Arabic speaking to understand how Syria is still within the sphere of influence of the US, read a book by Kamal Jumblat called هذه وصيتي. Lebanon, this is my will. But that's another subject by itself. But this is an area, the reason why I brought it, this is an area where the US and Russia worked together and cooperated for a purpose that would serve both of them. Because it's neither their interest for Iran to take over Syria. So with this in mind, Russia and China start looking around and seeing a weakness in the world order. That's why Biden kept saying to the Europeans, this is dangerous. This will change the game. This will change the world order. This will do, this will do, this will do. To get all of them under his leadership. And we see that he did not succeed. We see that, the French president jumped and he was talking to Putin. The British went and talked to Putin. And what did the Russians say when there was a meeting with Macron of France? Macron came out and said, Putin made a commitment to me that he will not invade Ukraine. Immediately after he left to meet with the Ukrainian president, Russia issued a statement that was very humiliating to who? To Macron, saying, we did not give you a commitment. Plus, who are you? If we want to discuss this issue, we will discuss it with the leader of the NATO, the US. That was humiliating. The same thing happened with the British. So the British foreign minister met with the Russian foreign minister. And they were talking and talking and talking. And Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, came out and said, this was like a deaf talking to a blind. That was his statement. So they were humiliating those countries because they are worthless for them. Their main concern, their main target is the head. Yes, we cannot knock the head off, but let's shake the order and get Russia and China to take their place in the world. So they will be number 2 and number 3. They will no longer be one superpower, and that's it in this regard. So as of now, it seems that the Europeans are shaking. They do not want to take strong measures against Russia. They want to make some sanctions, but to a certain extent. Because they know that they cannot rely on the US. I mean, anyone who knows what's happening with Ukraine and Taiwan knows that you cannot rely on the US. With Taiwan, they are sending some Americans to train the Taiwanese. I mean, give me a break. If each Chinese carry a bucket of water and spill it over Taiwan, it will be in the sea. It will sink. Just a bucket of water, not to talk about the weapons. And they were saying, oh, we're going to send planes to as I mentioned to you one time, if you want to understand that issue, China looked like that big wall where the brothers are sitting. And Taiwan is the tip of my finger. Look at the map. That's how big China is. And Taiwan, you do not see it. But the US is saying, we'll give you arm, we'll sell you arm, we will not accept with this, we will not accept that. Another weakness that was shown also in the Olympics. Putin said we're going to boycott. How many countries follow? Many of the world leaders went. So, yes, there is a big price that's being paid by many innocent people in this conflict. And we Muslims know that because we have paying heavy price for casualties in the Iraq war and the Afghan war for the last 20 plus years, 30 years. We know what it means to get into wars and the casualties. On the other side, the strategic side, what is happening should shake the world order. To what extent remain to be seen. To what extent remain to be seen. But this now will open the door. So let's say, a country like Turkey, who have some areas that it considered part of Turkey, they will say it's time to claim it. Iran may do the same. China might do the same. Any country that have power, because now the big brother is not the big brother anymore. We have, a big brother and two other big brothers in there. And to say that the sanctions will make a difference, nonsense. Iran, which is much weaker than Russia, went through and survived the sanctions, and now the US is sitting and talking with Iran. So the sanctions, it will hurt the economy here and there and this and this and that, but that's nothing compared with what Russia have strategically achieved. Basically saying, what we think matter and what we'll do matter, and we're going to protect our interests no matter what. Trump was saying, this is very savvy and this is genius. This is Trump was saying about Putin. And who said the same? His foreign minister, Pompeo. It's mind-boggling when you see this, but that's actually what this thing is ongoing. So, to summarize, we need to understand that Russia will not sacrifice Ukraine to NATO. Because if they do, NATO will be on their borders. The US does not need to send intercontinental missiles to Russia. They just send it from the border. That's why Turkey was always very important to NATO, because they could eavesdrop on the Soviet Union in the old days. Turkey is close there. And that's why they have nuclear weapons. They kept it in Turkey. And they kept in Turkey the best tools for intelligence in the world, because they were spying on the Soviets next to their door. So the Minsk Agreement was made in 2014 with the objective of what's coming. Needless to say, if we compare this with what's going on in our countries, Muslim countries, you just realize, where we are. The Egyptian government yesterday issued the declaration that, Isha and Taraweeh prayer will be only for half an hour, because we want people to be safer from Corona. 3 weeks ago, they had 60,000 Egyptians in the soccer game with Senegal for 3 hours sitting next to each other. So what our leaders are thinking of, how we can combat Islam and how we can spread mischief and spread fasad among the people. Are they thinking ahead? No. Bahrain just announced that the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence, they have a base in Bahrain. You can't say, what? It's not hidden. They are saying we have a base, Mossad intelligence in Bahrain, stationed there. Take it from there to conflicts between Morocco and Algeria, to what's happening in Libya, to what's happening in there, and you would see that, basically what we have is tools that are put in power by the colonialist or the new colonialists. And just to give you a very quick example and we close, last 2 weeks there was lots of talk in Palestine about this big meeting that's supposed to take place and who's going to attend and who's not going to attend. The whole meeting, the objective of it was to put an Israeli agent by the name of Hussein al-Sheikh to be in a leadership position. And now the US and Israel, the Zionists, are telling the Palestinian Authority, we will accept only one of two people to be the president of Palestine. Either Majid Faraj, the head of the intelligence, or Hussein al-Sheikh, the head of the coordination with the Israelis. This is not the Palestinian thinking. This is the Israelis and the Americans telling them. So the first step, get Hussein al-Sheikh to oppositional power so that it will be natural for him to become president. So they are planning for our, unfortunately, so-called leaders, and that's where our status is. Compare this with the countries that look for their own interest, from South Korea to Japan. We are not only talking about superpowers who are looking for their own interest and for their own people. I say this and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring the khair and the good for this ummah. We have some time, inshallah, for comments and questions. Yes, Muhammad. Allah barak feek.
Question regarding, you mentioned that some countries, and Ukraine and Russia and superpowers are doing what they're doing, and then the Muslim countries, for example, Egypt, said that 30 minutes for Isha and Tarawih, and you see that example with a lot of Muslim countries that are making it more difficult for Muslims. I wonder, what is the reasoning for it? What is the benefit for the Muslim governments for doing that? And then the second part of the question, out of the Muslim countries that we know, what is the best one in your opinion for Muslims?
Well, as far as the first part, why the political leaders in the Muslim countries are conspiring against Islam, it's more than onefold. One is this issue of terrorism that the US started. So that basically created a new paradigm for those countries, for the world, in fact, in this regard. So it became easy. Look at the Zionists. I mean, the Zionists just go in the middle of Nablus, kill 3 young men, and said they are terrorists. Even, the late Edward Said, his statement a few weeks before he died, he said the US bombed Afghanistan and killed so many people, and it's enough they say we killed terrorists. Nobody cared who was killed, what's their names, what's this, nobody cared. Because, the US said terrorist, it's enough. This is trademark. He said similarly the Israelis, the Zionists, bombed Gaza, killed so many people, they just said we killed terrorists. In fact, the event that took place in Kabul when the US withdrew with this humiliating withdrawal, and they bombed this car. They bombed this car and they killed 10 people, among them 7 children. The US said we, bombed ISIS. The New York Times correspondent was there. He said it was a civilian, and this guy was working with NGOs. And the US government and Defense Department said we killed, ISIS. And the reporter kept saying, no, this is this. He was there. He was saying this. If he was not there, the US would went with the story. We killed terrorists. So they killed 7 children and 3 civilians who have absolutely nothing to do with this. So that's what this thing is. They use this to say to their masters, we are taking care. You are taking of Islam around the world and Muslims and this and that, and labeling, Daesh and others. We are taking care of our own. That's one. Secondly, in terms of the Muslim country, what we see in the past 15 years, that the country that stands for the causes of Muslims, although not always, but most of the time, was Turkey. For example, when Somalia was devastated from the war, and no airline will go there. So Erdogan will take 3 planes from Turkish Airlines full of supplies, and he will fly himself to Somalia, to Mogadishu, and he will command that the Turkish airline start flying there. In Africa, it's now known statement. Chinese money, Russian soldiers, and Turkish mosques. If you read Western media, by the way, you hear this statement. What's changing in Africa right now? What is making a change in Africa? Chinese money, Russian soldiers, and Turkish mosques, meaning Turkish spread of Islamic influence within those countries. This is not my statement. This is what those guys are talking about, and we have many evidence to this effect in this regard. Qatar, to a certain extent, tried to help, but Qatar helped within what is allowed by the British and the US, because they do not have, until in fact Turkey, but because they realized when United Arab Emirates and Saudi had a plan to invade Qatar and take over, there was a plan. It's all ready to go. And Tamim made a deal with the Turkish, and the second day the Turkish tanks were in Qatar, because they realized that the US will not do anything for them, although there are thousands of US troops in this regard. But Qatar moves within the allowed area for them to maneuver. So yeah, they help Muslim causes in many places around the world and this and that, but it's with that aspect. Recently, you start hearing also Imran Khan saying a statement that many leaders would not say about Muslims and the blight of Muslims. So, they tried to form, in fact, with Indonesia and Malaysia and Turkey and Pakistan, a new alliance to be versus the Muslim World League, which is controlled by the Saudi. So I would say that there is some trend. Where is this going? To what extent remain to be seen. But when you look at the rest of the leadership of the Muslim world, unfortunately, what you see is people who are aiming at this Islam, and wherever there's any smell of that, this Islam may show its head. Does that address?
And just to follow up, the U.S. intelligence is still present in Turkey, similar to how it was.
Of course. No. The U.S. intelligence, no, there was a big withdrawal, and after the coup, because Erdogan was convinced that the U.S. played a role in the coup. And some go to the extent that says the plans were made in the American base in Turkey. So after that, yeah, there were some changes, and they took some of the equipment and some of the sophisticated things from there. But I think, the former head of the CIA, Ozley, I saw him on TV saying, first of all, they have to kill or capture Erdogan. That's the first thing that they need to do. What? You give him direction to the... this is before the coup, was foiled. While this thing going, he was given direction. He said, those guys, they need to kill Erdogan or capture him. And they need to do this. Do you need, somebody will say, well, he's a former CIA. Yeah, he's a former CIA, but he's not a former janitor in the White House. He's the former head of the CIA. So he expressed the sentiment of the leadership. And from my perspective, the US would have loved for Erdogan to be killed. Of course, Turkey is not one-man show. There are many now, alhamdulillah, who carry these ideas. But still, you would see that Turkey have many issues, from secularism to being forced to deal with the Zionists on and off, to try to face, their place. But the fact that they can say no to the US, that by itself means that they are an independent country. And we do not have many independent Muslim countries. We do not. The strongest in terms of having nuclear weapons will be Pakistan, but Pakistan is in the hands of the Chinese. And they made it clear to the US. When Trump cut all the funding from Pakistan, the Pakistan said, we are strategically aligned with China. Any other? So, in close, I would say, inshallah, Islam is coming, there's no doubt about it. All the ahadith, the ayat indicates that the future is for this deen. It's a question when this ummah will be ready to resume its role. And as Sayyid Qutb, Allah yarhamu, said, the world does not need from us to offer advances in technology and industry. The world needs a different way of life. And what we see around the world is, yes, indeed, that's what's needed. A way of life that gives the humanity peace and tranquility, the peace of mind, and the absolute justice, which is for all of us to be servants of the Creator, not servants of men or other nations. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. We'll see you next Thursday, inshallah.